chaired by none other than Sri Debashi Sen. I would like to welcome Sir on stage. Sri Debashi Sen is an experienced Indian Administrative Service officer with 34 years of service in urban development, governance, and technology. He led West Bengal's Urban Development Department, transforming greenfield land into a smart city with 60,000 residents. As CEO for over a decade, he directed and developed development of 7,000-acre satellite township, incorporating innovations like e-governance, AI, blockchain, and IoT. He was instrumental in creating the state's first township policy, fostering sustainable urban growth. As Chief Electoral Officer, his Ananda Babu helpline revolutionized voter engagement. Trained at the Harvard University and the IMF Institute, he specializes in public finance and smart cities, electoral reforms, and investment facilitation. With great pleasure, now I would like to introduce our distinct speaker for today, Professor Richard S.J. Toll. Professor Toll is a professor at the University of Sussex and Rijksuniversiteit Amsterdam, specializing in economics of climate change. He is a member of the Academia Europaea and has held positions at the Economic and Social Research Institute, Hamburg University, and Carnegie Mellon University, among others. Professor Toll has also been a visiting scholar at various prestigious institutions, including Princeton University and University College London. He holds an MSc in econometrics and a PhD in economics from Rijksuniversiteit Amsterdam. Ranked among the top 100 economists globally, Professor Toll has published over 300 articles in academic journals, one book, and 3 edited volumes. Sir, I would like to welcome you now. The session is all yours.
It's an honor and pleasure to be here. I note that my bio is out of date because last week I published the second book. I'm going to talk for the next 50 minutes or so about the economic impacts of climate change. I realize that it is a bit of a departure of the usual subjects of this conference, but I hope that you will indulge me. So the topics I'm going to cover are these. I'm going to start by talking about the global impacts of climate change on human welfare, talk about the distribution of those impacts, show some recent econometric work on this as well, and then I'm going to talk, if time permits, on the social cost of carbon. But let's just dive right in. What you're looking at here is the sum total, the population of all estimates of the economic impact of climate change. This is a complicated graph. The way to read it is just have to point with my hands. On the horizontal axis, you're looking at scenarios of climate change. The severity of climate change is indexed by the change in the global mean surface air temperature. This is not because we think that the global mean surface air temperature is that relevant, but this is just an indicator of the seriousness of climate change. On the vertical axis, you're looking at the Higgsian equivalent variation. And the way to read this graph is that if you look at 2.5 degrees of warming, then the average person would feel as if she had lost 1.9% of her income. This is not the change in income, but this is the Higgsian equivalent variation. You would feel as if you had lost 1.9% of your income. 1.9 is the average of the symbols that you see around 2.5 degrees. And that is what these symbols mean. There are in total 72 estimates of the welfare impact of climate change that have been published in 40 papers, and each of the dots and squares and circles that you see is one of those estimates. The first impression that you get from this particular graph is one of confusion, that people disagree about how serious climate change is, and they disagree a little bit on the sign as well, but definitely on the magnitude of these impacts. And some people find that worrying. I actually think that is a good thing, that there is disagreement in the literature, because we are talking about predicting the impacts of things that will unfold over the next 100 years or longer. And it's an unprecedented change in it's an unprecedented change in essentially the existence of Homo sapiens, right? So if you would sort of expect that people would agree on these things, then there must be really something wrong in the literature. They're messing with my slides. So now what do these numbers tell you? And another thing that, here we go. One thing that surprises people is that a little bit of warming may actually be good for us. But if you think a little bit deeper about this should not surprise you at all. If it gets warmer in winter, you need less money to heat your home during winter, which is a big plus. Also, in places that are more temperate than India, actually a lot of people die from cold-related diseases. And if winters get warmer, that will be less of that. Finally, and that is more relevant for a place like India, the root cause of climate change is the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere, and CO2 is plant food. Now, that is actually not such a big deal because very few plants are CO2 limited. But if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, then plants also become more water efficient. They need to keep their stomata open for less long, and that means that they evaporate less water, and that means that you can grow the same crops with less irrigation input, and this is a big boon for agriculture in semi-arid areas. And those are the three reasons why people say that a little bit of warming may actually be good for us. Now, what I did not say was that the 0 point that you see there, the origin of this graph, is the pre-industrial climate. And we are already at, estimates disagree, we are already at 1.3 or 1.4 degrees of warming since 1750. And that means that the benefits, the initial benefits that you see there, are things that have happened already. These are definitely sunk benefits and may even be benefits in the past. If you focus on the future, then actually what you see is that the negative impacts of climate change dominate the positive ones. The negative impacts of climate change are many. I talked about spending less money on heating your home in winter. You will need to spend more money on cooling your home during summer, right? Cooling energy demand will go up. There's heat-related deaths as well as cold-related deaths. Heat-related deaths will increase. Same is true for tropical diseases such as malaria and dengue, schisto. Those sort of diseases will become more prevalent in a warmer and wetter climate. The effects of climate change, not CO2 in the atmosphere, but the changes in climate are actually by and large negative on agriculture. Of course, we have sea level rise. Places like Kolkata are vulnerable to that. What we also expect is an increase, not so much in the frequency of storms, but definitely in the intensity of storms is likely to go up in a warmer climate. One thing that may be of particular concern to India is that we actually don't know what climate change will do to the monsoon. But some models say that monsoons will fail in the future more frequently than they do now. And that is, of course, a big problem for agriculture in this country. And last, but certainly not least, because we are warm-blooded animals, we are actually not very good at coping with heat. This is a problem, a health problem for the elderly, for the very young, people with cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. For those of us who are healthy, actually, if it gets warmer and more humid, actually it's harder for the body to actually do physical work, and labor productivity falls. And this is actually a very substantial effect, particularly in humid places like Southeast Asia. What we see Some of the models tell you that 2 to 3 degrees of warming would lead to a drop in labor productivity of 30% or so, right? And this is a room of economists, so I don't need to explain the results of that. So those are the negative effects, and they actually begin to dominate relatively soon. There's a few outliers there that I need to talk about, where there's 3 studies, 2 studies that show very substantial positive impacts for fairly profound warming. 2 of those estimates I'll talk about later. I think they just messed up their econometrics. The other positive impact that you see there is by 2 very well-respected economists, published in a very well-respected journal. What they assume in this model is full factor mobility. So if you assume that capital can be invested wherever the returns on investment are highest, there is no frictions on the international capital market, and if you assume that there's full labor mobility, then climate change will actually be good for us. As you know, in the very long run, we eventually all came out of Africa. These papers by these 2 economists actually have an into Siberia type of future for us. If you assume full capital mobility, full labor mobility, then the world economy will move to Siberia, where the future climate will be very nice. If you're prepared to make that assumption, then climate change is good. If you're not prepared to make that assumption, then perhaps you should discount this particular estimate. So this is roughly what the literature tells you. There's a lot of disagreement about these things. Also, as you see, different methods actually give you different results. The gray line that I fitted there is a Bayesian model average of 7 popular impact functions. If we use that to scale everything to 2.5 degrees, we can draw a histogram. And there the confusion actually largely disappears. What you see is that by and large, the very pronounced mode of this is that 2.5 degrees of warming will bring a welfare loss of somewhere between 0 and 2% equivalent income, right? You see that there's some estimates that say, well, it's actually going to be a benefit for the world economy. But you also see that the uncertainty is fairly pronounced and that it's skewed the wrong way, that negative surprises are much more likely than positive surprises of equal but opposite magnitude. So much for what's happening at the global average. That is not particularly interesting because very few people live at the global average. Let's look at the distribution of these impacts. So I'm going to use the same data, but now I'm going to not plot them against scenarios of climate change, severity of climate change, but I'm going to plot them against the current situation. So of these 72 estimates that you see, a fair number have regional detail as well. And I use that regional detail then to interpolate things to the country level. And that is what we see on this graph. So this is the impact. Again, it's a Higgs equivalent variation. It's the how climate change would make you feel compared to your income. But now plotted against the income level in the year 2015, right? So you see the very poor countries on the left and the richer countries on the right. And this is a logarithmic scale, right? It runs from 100 to $100,000 per person per year. And you see a very clear pattern emerging. That is, poorer countries are much more vulnerable to climate change than our richer countries. You may actually wonder, how can this graph add up to minus 1% at the global average? That doesn't make any sense until you realize that in the previous graph that I showed, we added dollars, $2. And then, of course, the rich countries, which, as you see, have fairly benign impacts of climate change, dominate the global average, right? So that is why this particular picture adds up to minus 1%. That's because we add dollars, not welfare or people. But you see a very clear pattern here poorer countries are much more vulnerable to climate change than richer countries. There are three structural reasons for that. One is the structure of the economy. I live in the UK. Most people work in retail or in publishing or in banking or in finance, right? That is, they work in offices indoors, not exposed to climate and weather. If you look at poorer countries, a lot of people work in agriculture. They work outside. They are directly exposed to the weather, right? So that is the first reason why poorer countries are much more vulnerable. I'm going to replace the horizontal axis with the current average temperature. And what you see here is that hotter countries are much more vulnerable than colder countries. This should not surprise you. The plants and animals on which we rely are much closer to the biophysical limits in hot places than in cold places. So that is one reason why you would expect much more negative impacts if it gets warmer still. The other reason has to do with adaptation. If you live like I do in Brighton and you wonder what would a 3 degrees warmer climate be like and how would we cope, then you would look at how do people in Marseille or in Barcelona cope with the heat. And we would simply copy their technologies, their behavior, their institutions. If you live in the hottest city on the planet, like Jacobabad or Singapore or Dar es Salaam, then you would have to invent all those new things, how to cope with an additional 2 or 3 degrees of heat. You would have to invent that from scratch, which is much, much more difficult than copying somebody else's behavior, right? So that is the second reason why poorer countries are much more vulnerable to climate change than our colder countries, because poor countries tend to be hot and hot countries tend to be poor, right? The third reason has also to do with adaptation. A lot of adaptation to climate change is private. Changes in your clothing, changes in how you heat your house, and so those are decisions that you make for yourself. But a lot of other aspects of adaptation to climate change are public. If you're talking about coastal defense, we look to the government to build dikes and seawalls and those sort of things. If you're talking about the impacts of climate change on human health, we look at the public health system to restore ourselves to health, right? And that means that the government has a big role to play in adaptation as well. The implication of this, the reason that this is on this graph, is that if you live in a country where the government cannot really collect taxes because they simply lack the capacity to raise money, then of course they cannot pay for those public goods. Or if you live in a country where the government can raise money, but there's no qualified engineers, no qualified project managers to spend that money wisely, then you have a problem with delivering public goods. If you live in a country where the government is so corrupt that even if they plan to build these things, the money instead disappears into Swiss bank accounts and London villas, then you have a problem with public goods. Or if you live in a country where the government simply doesn't care about the people, then of course those public goods will not be delivered either. Now, those four factors that I mentioned, state capacity, corruption, ability to deliver public goods, those four things we call in this literature adaptive capacity, and essentially that is a lack of adaptive capacity is both a cause and a consequence of underdevelopment, right? And the implication is that poorer countries are much worse at adaptation than our richer countries. So that explains this particular pattern that you see. Now, two of the three reasons that I gave you that explain this pattern would lead you to the Schelling conjecture, right? If you are worried about climate change and you're worrying about the impacts of climate change on poorer countries, there's two things you can do. One, you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that would take away climate change and therefore a lot of the impacts of climate change. But if it is true that the most serious impacts of climate change are symptoms of mismanagement and underdevelopment, then of course economic growth would take away a lot of these problems, right? And that is something that people in Europe and North America often forget, and I think we should not forget that. So economic growth would actually take away a lot of the pain of climate change. Here we see just dots, right? And therefore it is very hard to identify the country. Here, this is the same plot, but now I add a third dimension, and the size of the bubble is the population in 2015 of the country. So you can see where you are, right? We see the United States, we see China in the middle, and then the big one at the bottom, that of course is India. And you see that the expected impact of climate change on India as it is today, or really as it was in the recent past, would be quite severe. Something like the equivalent of losing 12% of your income, which for a relatively poor country is a really big welfare loss, right? I've said all these things. Climate change is a problem, but the global average impact is actually not that large, perhaps 2%. The impact is much larger in poorer countries, but the most severe impacts are symptoms of underdevelopment and mismanagement. And that, of course, if you could improve these things, economic growth would actually take away a lot of the pain. Now, some people get upset when I show these numbers and they think they should be much larger. And I actually agree. These numbers are underestimates. And there's two basic reasons why these numbers are underestimates. One is that the histogram that I showed you is an incomplete assessment. And we can actually get a grip on that because it's not only true that some of these impact estimates have regional detail that I talked about, they also have sectoral detail. And if you compare the sectoral detail in the various studies, then you actually find that the sectoral coverage is very diverse. And if you then use, say, the air pollution estimates that are included in the Fankhauser study, but not in the Nordhaus study, and you use that to impute what those impacts would be for the ones that are missing that, then what you find that on average, you need to add 73% to the estimates that I've shown. So roughly, you need to double the numbers that I talked to you about a minute ago, right? So this is a relatively simple imputation exercise. We can complete the estimates to the extent that things have been estimated, and that would lead to a doubling of the estimates that I talked about earlier. There is a second doubling coming, and that is the impacts of climate change on economic growth. And it's going to take me a little bit longer to explain that. It's a very sensitive little machine. So there's a burgeoning literature at the moment where people look at the effects of weather shocks on economic growth. This is a literature that was started by Melissa Dell and colleagues, Ben and Ben, but has taken off since publication in Nature by the study by Marshall Burke and Solly Xiang and Ted Miguel. And the impetus for this line of research was really that the previous impact studies that I talked about are all based on calibrated models, because it is so very difficult to identify the effects of climate, because climate hasn't changed much over the period where we have good data. Climate, of course, is much more varied over space, but it's basically confounded with everything else that we know drives development. So econometrically, you just have a big issue, a big problem on your hand trying to identify the impacts of climate on the level of development. So what people instead have been doing is saying, well, climate is sort of correlated with all sorts of everything, but weather, at least from an economic perspective, is random. And there's disagreement among meteorologists whether weather is really random or not, but from an economic perspective, it's orthogonal to whatever is happening in the economy. So therefore, the effects of weather on economic growth are properly identified, or at least so these papers claim. So what people have been doing since for the last 12 years or so is estimate the impacts of weather on economic growth. And here you see the results of 9 of these studies. Again, these studies are all over the place, right? You see positive impacts up to 6 degrees of warming. According to some studies, other studies show very negative impacts. And these are very large impacts. This is not, this is percentage points. So essentially, if you take the Kickstra study, that's the dark one that is somewhat to the bottom. Essentially, what their model says that if the world were to warm by 2 degrees, then we would take away 2% of economic growth, 2 percentage points of economic growth. So if the per capita income grows on average 2% per year in normal times, then with 2 degrees of warming, that 2% would become 0%, right? We would stop growing. And if we go to 6 degrees of warming, then the world economy would actually start shrinking at 8% per year, right? So this is truly the end of civilization. Very quickly, we're down to subsistence farming, if not hunting gathering, right? If this particular model is the case. Now, there is a recent study out of Harvard by Bilal and Kenzir, where they actually have that a 1 degree global warming would actually lead to a 12% drop in economic growth, right? That is the most pessimistic study that is out there. I'm happy to talk about why they find this during the coffee break. The basic specification for these studies you see at the very top. What people essentially have done is regress the growth rate of the economy on the level of the temperature. Now, econometrically, that is very strange because essentially you're regressing a flow on a stock, and that seems unbalanced, right? That is just like, why would you now come back to this? So there's a number of other studies that said that you should really regress the change in income on the change in the temperature rather than on the temperature itself. If you do that, there's 4 studies that done this. The following picture emerges. You still see a wide range of results. You still see a lot of disagreement, mostly to do with specification and with estimators. But the most important thing here is that the vertical axis has changed. The meaning is still the same. So here we see a range of minus 14% to plus 4%. If we regress the growth rate on the change in the temperature, we see essentially minus 0.14. Instead of 14%, we see 0.14% to plus 0.04%. So 2 orders of magnitude smaller. Right? So that this seemingly innocuous change in specification has a very, very big effect. So then the question emerges, which of the 2 strands of this literature is the correct one? Now, I marked one study here with NGFS, and some of you will know that this stands for the Network on the Greening of the Financial System. This is essentially the club of central bankers that care about climate change. And this particular green line is their base model. This is what central banks nowadays think climate change will do to the economy. And this is where current policy across a lot of countries, current monetary policy is based on this particular study. As you see, it's an outlier in this literature. And if you don't like this specification, but you think we should use this specification, then we're actually 2 orders of magnitude off, dear central bankers. Now, how come? This is based on a model by Leonie Wens and colleagues in Potsdam. Here you see the basic specification. And there's a whole bunch of econometricians in the room. This is not what we teach our students, right? So what they do is they regress the growth rate of the economy on the change in temperature, and on the change in temperature interacted with the temperature itself. But then they forget the base effect of the temperature, right? That is not there. The reason that they exclude this is an act of climate denial. They assume that T is constant, which of course it is not. If it were, we would not worry about climate change. The real reason that they do this, well, they assume it's constant, and then of course your dummies wipe it out, right? That is the reason that they give. Now, this is a very peculiar specification. Essentially, this is a model, if you think back of Barrow, this is a model of club convergence, and the clubs are formed by the current temperature. So this is a form of climate determinism, right? You are poor because you are hot, is essentially what these models say. And if you start this model, run this model not over the sample periods from 1960 to 2020, but you actually start the model, say, at the time of Christ and run it forward, what you would find is that this model predicts that poor countries are poor because they are hot. Also, if you then take this model and run it into the future, what you would find is that if we succeed in stopping climate change at a permanently higher temperature, then the growth rate of these countries would be permanently lower, right? There is no recovering from climate change, even if it stops climate change. So it is theoretically a very peculiar specification. The econometric problems are also there. Essentially, they cannot include the base temperature because of the dummies that they include. And that immediately implies that your dummies become correlated with your variable of interest, and you cannot really interpret the model. And you cannot really use the model to extrapolate. And that is what you see in this particular graph. This is a complicated slide again. So the two histograms that you see are two sets of models, the growth models versus the level models that I talked about. And essentially what they did in this study is they used the same data set, and then they ran 400 alternative specifications of the same model, and then just looked at what do these models predict. And if you have good eyes, you can see that again, this one specification leads to an effect size that is 100 times as large as the other specification. But that is not why I show this, because I've told you this already. On the right-hand side, you're looking at the results of a cross-validation study, where essentially they have 5 decades of data. They left out one of the 5 decades and see whether the other 4 decades could predict that decade. And then they have 160 countries. They left out 10 countries at a time and checked whether the 150 countries could predict the 10 remaining countries. And they did that systematically across all permutations. And what you find is, essentially going back to the dummies, that these growth models, do not pass the cross-validation test. And the reason for this is that those dummies absorb a whole lot of stuff in sample. But as soon as you move out of sample, your dummies are no longer there to help you. And they really rely on the dummies. So these models really go off the rails as soon as you move out of sample. And as I said, they left out 10 years out of 50. They're not predicting 100 years into the future, what we need to do for climate change. But these models can't even predict 10 years into the future, right? But still, our central bankers rely on this information to make monetary policy. This is key. Now, I promised you reconciliation. Here we are. So on the very left, you're looking at my starting point, these comparative static models that I talked to you first, and I derived this nice histogram from that. Then to the very right, you're looking at the empirical studies, the weather shocks and the level ones, and then immediately next to it, the growth models, the ones that I would argue are misspecified in the do not pass the cross-validation test. And you see that the implications for what is happening in the far future are very, very different. Now, these comparative static models are comparative static, but of course, what we can do is say, well, if economic output in 2024 is lower than it would have been without climate change, then of course that has dynamic implications, because if you have less money to go around, you will invest less, and therefore your capital stock in 2026 is lower, and therefore your output next year is lower as well. And that, of course, then accumulates. So if we stick these comparative static results in a standard growth model, then the bar that is second to the left for you guys appears, the implied impact on economic growth. And what you see is that this one set of better studies is a bit of an outlier. What you can't see on this graph, but you can see on this one, is that if we compare the implied growth effects of the comparative static literature to the estimated growth effects in the weather shock literature, if the model is correctly specified, are actually fairly close together. That is the second and the fourth bar that you look at. And that's sort of, I think, increases the confidence that these estimates are not completely nuts. Okay, let's switch here. So far, I've been talking about what is the total economic impact of climate change, which would be an interesting estimate if we could take away climate change altogether, but we can't. The best we can hope for is reduce greenhouse gases by a little bit, and therefore we should look at the impacts at the margin rather than the impacts in total. The marginal impacts are known as the social cost of carbon. Social cost of carbon is essentially the additional damage done if we emit 1 extra ton of carbon dioxide. And it's a room full of economists, so I don't need to tell you that if we evaluate this marginal along the optimal emission trajectory, then this is what most people call the Pigou tax, although Pigou had nothing to do with this. This was really proposed by Bator much later. This is the tax that restores the economy to its efficient level. Because this is such a central number in the economic analysis of climate change and optimal climate policy, and because a number of governments are committed to doing cost-benefit analysis on their public investments, and that's particularly the United States, there is a large literature on the social cost of carbon. This slide came unexpected. What you see, there's a large literature on the social cost of carbon, and I'm going to show you some of the results on the next slide, not on this slide. Here you see the actual definition of the social cost of carbon. It is at least a triple sum. So you aggregate impacts across the world. You aggregate impacts across alternative futures, alternative scenarios, and of course it's a net present value. You also aggregate across time, right? So there's at least 3 summation signs here, or integral signs, as you wish. The social cost of carbon depends on a whole bunch of assumptions, and some of them, these assumptions are positive. What would future emissions be? How would the climate warm in response to changes in the atmospheric concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases? Those are positive questions where reasonable people can come to an agreement about how to approach this question, and they may converge on some sort of PDF about what those numbers, what those parameters would be. Other assumptions are normative assumptions. How do we aggregate across people? How do we aggregate across different scenarios of the future? How do we account for risk aversion, ambiguity aversion, those sort of things? And of course, also, how do we aggregate across time? What is the discount rate that goes into? Where reasonable people can reasonably disagree about what those parameters should be, right? Now, as I said, there's a large literature on this. On my latest count, 376 papers have been published on the social cost of carbon. And because computers get ever faster and because there are so many assumptions that you need to make, those 400 papers have produced more than 13,000 estimates of the social cost of carbon, right? That is the current count, and there are papers appearing almost every week nowadays. And what you're looking at here is the histogram of those estimates. And what you see is that there's a small number of studies, small number of estimates that actually say we should be subsidizing coal. But the vast majority says, no, this is a social cost of carbon, not a social benefit of carbon. We should be taxing coal. What you also see is a fairly pronounced mode that is actually fairly modest. And then you see this enormous right tail that just doesn't end. And it really doesn't end. I sort of cut it off at $1,600 per ton of carbon. The highest estimate of the social cost of carbon that I have found in the literature is actually $10 million per ton of carbon, right? So the tail just continues. And there are, of course, theoretical arguments why the tail is really unbounded. So having so many estimates, you can do all sorts of fancy things. Here we're looking at estimates of the social cost of carbon plotted against the year of publication, which of course not the same as the year that the estimate was generated. What you see is sort of like 20 years or so of estimates being all over the place. But since the year 2000, there's a bit of convergence in the literature, and you see that actually over time we have become more pessimistic about the impacts of climate change. And we have become slightly more pessimistic about climate change itself. But the main reason that you actually see this thing trending upwards is because the discount rate has fallen over time, or rather the discount rate assumed has fallen over time. But we see an upward trend in this literature. So this is one way of splitting the sample. Another thing that you can do is just look at how sensitive is this particular estimate to the assumptions that you make. And I'm going to start by talking, and probably end by talking about the discount rate. So here we're looking at the results of a quantile regression, because we have 13,000 estimates. We can just do a lot of fancy statistics. So here we're looking at how in the very middle, how the median social cost of carbon responds to the assumed pure rate of time preference, the utility discount rate, and also how the left tail responds to this and how the right tail responds to this, right? So these are the estimated parameters in a quantile regression. And what you see is exactly what you would expect. If the discount rate is lower, we care more about the future. If you care more about the future, you care more about climate change. If you care more about climate change, we want to impose a higher carbon tax, right? That is what you see, right? You also see that actually it's not just that the average increases and not just that the median increases, but actually the right tail responds particularly strongly. And this is no surprise because the lower your discount rates, effectively the further you need to peer into the future. And the further you peer into the future, the more uncertain things become. We have a reasonable idea what the world will be like next week, maybe in a year from now, maybe in 10 years from now. But if we are talking about a future 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now, then things become very, very uncertain, right? And if you use a very low discount rate, and of course there are people out there who argue that we should use a utility discount rate of 0.1% per year, then you really need to look not 1,000 years into the future, but 10,000 years into the future. So things become more confused, the uncertainty becomes larger, and that sort of like blows up your right tail, and that is explains this pattern here. This is the same regressions, but now not on the utility discount rate, the pure rate of time preference, but on the curvature of the utility function. In the middle, you see the signal that you would expect. On the tails, you see actually a bit of confusion, and that is because the curvature of the utility function sort of fulfills this triple role. One, it sort of governs risk aversion, and the more risk averse you are, the more you worry about climate change. But also, it sort of covers the trade-off between rich and poor, and between today and tomorrow in the Ramsey rate of discounting. And there, the more curved the utility function is, the higher your discount rate and the less you care about the future. And that explains some of the confusion that is going on here. But what you see is that, yes, the social cost of carbon is sensitive to these normative assumptions, and reasonable people can disagree about what the proper value of these numbers should be. Two more chapters and then I'll turn over to you. The social cost of carbon is the proposed global carbon tax. It is essentially assumes benevolent dictator for the whole world, or it assumes global cooperation on greenhouse gas emission reduction. Which then raises the question, so what is the national composition of the social cost of carbon? And the answer is in this particular graph. This is not the global social cost of carbon, but this is the regional breakdown. The global, if you add up all the numbers that you see here, the global adds up to around 24, maybe $29 per ton of carbon. And here you see, well, India contributes around 5.5 of that 24, and China contributes around 3 of that 24, and then you see other countries that contribute as well. And these are the top 25 countries. The analysis is actually done for 200 countries, but they're so small that it just gets boring to show them. The two insights here. One is that if you have a cooperative game, you get a different result than if you have a non-cooperative game. That should not surprise you. The other thing tells you something about the nature of the social cost of carbon. It's a marginal, but it's also an absolute. The social cost of carbon is higher if it falls on a larger economy, if it falls on more people, and it falls on people who are more vulnerable to climate change. And that is why the top 5, 6 countries that you see are the large economies. So India and China come top because that is where most of the people are. And then India tops China because India is a lot poorer than China. And then the next ones down are Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, Congo, Nigeria. Large and poor countries. That is where the damage will fall, also at the margin. Whereas the United States ranks only at number 23 of the countries with the highest social cost of carbon, right? And that is an important thing to keep in mind, that global climate policy is to the benefit of the countries at the top here, right? Now, there's another way of splitting this particular sample, the 400 papers or so that I talked about, and you can ask yourself, where did these numbers come from? Where are the scholars based that estimated these numbers? And there's only 21 countries that published, out of 200 or so, 21 countries that published estimates of the social cost of carbon. What you see is that 46% of this literature originates in the United States, 20% in the UK, a little bit in Germany, Netherlands, Ireland, Austria, and China actually ranks only 7th. And there's a whole bunch of countries that are simply not there, right? India has not, there's no scholar in India, based in India, who has published on the social cost of carbon. Which is worrying for two reasons. One, this is the global carbon tax. This is what the Indian government, the tax that the Indian government should put on its greenhouse gas emissions. And essentially, we're asking the government of India to rely on scholars in the United States and in China, and in Europe. Now, Xi Jinping is very upset about this and is actually working hard to increase the number of Chinese estimates. Modi hasn't quite copped on here. So that is one reason. The politics is just wrong. But there's another reason, and that is that the social cost of carbon depends on these normative parameters like risk aversion, time preference, and so on and so forth. And we actually know from surveys that different people in different cultures, actually in different religions, have very different views about these things and what these parameters should be. So in my final slide, final result for today, somebody decides to call me. No, it's the phone is ringing there. Sorry. What we did was we used a recently published study by Armin Falk. I know also done some good things. Armin Falk, where they interviewed 80,000 people across the world, or rather in 80 countries across the world, 1,000 people per country, about such things as their time preference and their risk aversion. And we ran that through a very standard integrated assessment model that is briefly described here. In the gray curve, we followed the literature on the social cost of carbon, where most people nowadays rely on the survey done by Moritz Dropp and colleagues, where they interview economists about what is the right rate of risk aversion, what is the right pure rate of time preference. And if you look at that study, they interviewed 200 people, all economists, and 192 of those are based in the global north, right? So that is one set of opinions. Then the yellow curve, we essentially mimic that, but we replace the 200 economists in the global north by, it must be around 15,000 people, general public in the global north, right? And what you see is that it's, in this particular case, we find that economists are not that different from the general population. Then in the blue curve, we say, well, let's look at the whole sample, and we use the preferences of the 80,000 people that were surveyed. And we count them we use the 80,000 people, we aggregate those 80,000 to 80 countries, and that is the results that you're looking at. And then in orange, we're just looking at the world population. We don't aggregate to countries first. And what you see is a very pronounced difference in the estimated social cost of carbon. That if you rely on Western experts, you get, if you just focus on the median, the 0.5, you get a much higher social cost of carbon of around 25 again. If we use the UN system, one country, one vote, that number falls to 10. If we use a direct democracy type of voting, then that number falls to 3, $3.5 per ton of carbon. So it's not just that the optics are wrong, in the sense that all these estimates for what you guys should be doing, how you should tax your emissions, are all based on estimates by people who work in countries far, far away from here, but also actually the parameter choices that people make may be different in different countries, and this has a substantial influence on the results. I'm out of time, so I'm going to skip this particular slide. I've said all these things. The more serious impacts of climate change are symptoms of underdevelopment and mismanagement. Climate change negatively affects human welfare, and this justifies climate policy. Maybe not as much as the popular media would want you to believe, but climate change is real and a real problem. And the estimated impact of carbon tax warrants a carbon tax, but there is very substantial disagreement about how high that carbon tax should be. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting in the sense that broadly the conclusions on the first 2 points were nothing that we did not know before, but putting numbers to it is really something that was very, very important. And the numbers, that is every ton of carbon involves how many dollars lost in the economy or slowdown in the GDP rate is very important, because if we are at all to go to the carbon tax regime, what will be the amount of the carbon tax? What will be the percentage and on the sector? For these, we need very much granular data sector-wise. I think it is this point that is at least my takeaway. And while we will certainly put up for a few questions and answers, I take the privilege of asking my first question, Professor, that my question is, you have mentioned about mismanagement of the economy by the less rich countries, where I would take it with a pinch of salt, but I will not get into an argument. But I would only say that would you also factor in the role of technology, the role of, for example, green hydrogen, nuclear energy, and all the research that is going on around artificial intelligence? Would you consider that to be an important ingredient of controlling the damage to the economy?
No, technology is obviously very important. I was talking about the impacts of climate change, not the costs of climate policy, but you have the same stories there. Sea level rise, you can say, well, how do we cope with that? We build dikes. The Sumerians knew how to build dikes, so this is a very old technology, but that is complete misrepresentation in what is going on in coastal zone protection. You actually see very substantial technological progress in how to protect coasts, and some countries have much better access to that technology than other countries. I am from the Netherlands, and it's a big export sector in the Netherlands to sell all these fancy technologies and advise on that. Another very popular and I think very pertinent example here of technological progress in adaptation has to do with malaria. I've been in this game for a long time. In the 1990s, we used to worry about what will climate change do to malaria. And it's fairly substantial. Every 1 degree or so, you would expect a 10% increase in the incidence of malaria, which is a very serious disease. I don't need to tell you that. But what we have done over the last 30 years or so, or what other people that we here is exclusive, right? It doesn't include me, is develop bed nets, re-allow DDT, develop vaccines for malaria, and therefore this disease is much less worrisome now than it was 30 years ago. The impact of climate change is still the same, but we have worked on solutions. The same is true for agriculture. People are working hard on drought-resistant crops and so on and so forth, right? So yes, technology is terribly important. And for some of these things, it doesn't really matter where the technology comes from, where it originates, but what matters is access to that technology, right? And some of these things are very expensive. One of the things that I did talk about is the impact of heat stress, and heat stress affects the obese much more than the people who are less weighty. And we now have these Wegovy drugs, right, which cost $100,000 per person per year, right? So this is a nice thing for people in Europe and the United States who have, but won't solve the problems in places like Haiti or something, where a lot of people are also terribly overweight, right? So there's the technology, and there's also the access to that technology. And then, of course, all these things constantly change, right?
Quite right. So a few questions so we can take perhaps from the audience if anybody wishes to make a point. Yes, please, Professor.
Hello. Thank you for giving us a very broad sweep of the analysis. I have just two questions. One is that if you look at the kind of analysis that is being done, it is about the effect of climate change on GDP. Okay, most of the stuff. My submission is that maybe instead of GDP, we should also start looking at the effect on income inequalities, because for countries like India, I think that is very important. And it is not a question of rich versus poor. You know, that doesn't really capture the whole thing. I don't know whether it is still in your slides. But so, you know, if we focus on GDP, then it's a trickle-down theory of growth and so on. So I think it is better also to think of, because the poor people get hurt much more than the richer people, even in poorer countries. That's number one. Number two is about focus on carbon tax. The focus on carbon tax means we are still relying on market mechanisms to correct what is going on. Okay. And again, I'm a little bit skeptical about countries like India, where whether market mechanisms, you know, would really work, or whether we need to go beyond that. And calculating the carbon tax, the social cost of carbon is very important, no doubt. Okay, that gives us a magnitude of what is happening, but still, a lot of the actions, mitigating actions, I think, would have to sort of not come from, I mean, an awareness of the carbon, social cost of carbon, but not focusing on carbon tax. Your thought.
Okay, the first question is a very valid point. I showed you the distribution of impacts across the world based on national averages. And there's a whole bunch of fairly heroic assumptions that go into this. People are working on downscaling this further to income classes and other sorts of classifications of households, right? The pattern that emerges is qualitatively the same, that it's not just poorer countries that are more vulnerable than richer countries, but also poorer people in the same country are more vulnerable than richer people in the same country, for roughly the same structural, broad scope of reasons. I did not put it up because I was running out of time anyway, and the number of studies that actually have done this are actually fairly few. We're talking about 2 or 3 studies that have managed to downscale below the national level in a meaningful way. Now, I talked about the social cost of carbon because that's a nice summary statistic of what is the damage at the margin. It sort of like advocates what is the PGU tax. I did not talk about policy design for climate policy at all, right? The sort of the textbook solution to a problem like climate change is a carbon tax, uniform carbon tax, and nothing but a carbon tax, right? That is what a textbook would recommend. That is, of course, not how policy really works. Actually, very few countries have a carbon tax. The tradable permits are much more popular than carbon taxes, mostly for political reasons, not for economic reasons. But actually, the vast majority of climate policy is done in a different way through technical standards or mandates and those sort of things. Now we have, of course, a Samuelsonian equivalent here, right? That for every sort of technological standard that you impose, there is an equivalent tax. And you could interpret the social cost of carbon in that way, that this is the cost of the margin that you would want to impose as for the technical standard that you pick. So absolutely that is there. I did not go into that because I picked a different topic, and other people are better suited to talk about those things. I would add, though, that Beaumont was absolutely right here, that the cheapest way of implementing climate policy is to have a uniform marginal cost of emission reduction. And uniformity in marginal cost is more easy to establish with a tax or tradable permits than with different standards for different industries and different companies based on the size within industry and so on and so forth. And that is a principle I don't think we should forget. I'm based in Europe, as I've said. One thing that we see currently politically in Europe that is happening is that there is a backlash against climate policy, mostly because people think it is too expensive. This is particularly true for countries like the Netherlands and Germany, and to a lesser extent the United Kingdom, also true in France. And that is a reason to keep the cost of climate policy as low as possible, which of course militates for something like a carbon tax rather than other policy instruments. So I don't think we should forget the political backlash, the potential political backlash if we make climate policy unnecessarily costly, as a lot of countries in Europe have done. Right?
That was very clear and very elaborately explained. Any other question? We can take one more.
One question is not only the backlash in Europe, but I'm sure that you know about it, that it would have a backlash in America as well, as Donald Trump is coming. And people may not, our own estimation for the developing countries, including India, is if you put this carbon, the tax, it would, maybe about 30 to 35% on an average, and would make our products uncompetitive in the European market. And therefore, we see it very differently as a non-tariff barrier for our products to enter into the European market. So I am not very sure that, what you have thought of this, because, and not only carbon tax, you also have, the EU is also have come out, only its implementation it delays with the deforestation. EU Deforestation Act, in which, products which are, primarily consumed and marketed in Europe, say like coffee, are absolutely not produced across Europe. And it is produced in countries like India, Brazil, Venezuela. And, if you impose this carbon tax, it is going to be, catastrophic to the poor farmer. And I'm very sure we are very happy that Donald Trump is with us. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. I don't disagree with anything you said. Of course, I am aware of what Trump thinks about climate change. You do need indeed to keep two things in mind when introducing a carbon tax. One, as you rightly point out, the effects on your international position in trade and your competitiveness. That should be an important consideration. Of course, if we introduce a global carbon tax or a harmonized carbon tax, those effects would be much smaller. The second thing that you point out is absolutely correct as well, that carbon taxes are relatively simple to implement for large formalized companies. But I did not talk about methane at all, right? But methane is the second most anthropogenic greenhouse gas. Methane comes out of rice farming. And yeah, economic theory says we should pose a tax on the methane that comes out of every rice paddy, right? Which is just completely impractical to do because it's not measured, let alone you're going to tax tens, hundreds of millions of small farmers. That's just not feasible, right? So there's a big divergence between what an economic textbook would say and what is actually feasible on the ground, and we should be aware of that. Absolutely agree.
Any other question? Yes, please, madam.
Good afternoon, sir. My question is regarding what are we thinking about taxing carbon which is being emitted due to war?
Oh God. Well, the economic principle is the same, right? It doesn't matter what the cause of the emission would be. My answer would be that we have many good reasons to worry about war that have nothing to do with climate change, and we would try and stop it for other reasons. And it's, of course, completely impractical, again, to impose a carbon tax on the military, let alone on non-state actors who are engaged in violent conflict, right? Well, I mean, there's one thing about proposing a tax, but a tax should also be implemented and enforced, right? And the idea of taxing somebody who's weapon to the teeth and is ready to shoot at you or your tax collectors may not be the most practical solution, right?
Absolutely. I don't think we have any more time. I'm sure. One last question. Okay, one last question by the lady over there.
So you said that the uniform marginal tax would be the most cost efficient, but it's also regressive. So how do you think that in poorer countries a regressive tax can be sold by the governments to their voters and implemented?
These are all excellent questions, but this one actually has a somewhat longer answer. But what you're saying used to be what we believed, right? That because most greenhouse gases come out of energy and agriculture. These are necessary goods. Therefore, anything that raises their price is regressive. That used to be the answer. There's been a lot of research on this in Europe. And typically what those studies find is that with the tax revenue, if you earmark 30, 35, maybe 40% of the tax revenues to compensate the poorest, either through increases in benefits or increases in tax credits, you could actually take away most of that pain, right? That is how the story used to be. Actually, that is not the complete story. So, energy is actually a very close complement to capital. And a public economist would argue that a tax on energy really is a tax on capital. Now, a tax on capital has two effects. One, it makes capital less attractive and therefore labor relatively more attractive. So if we tax energy, we tax capital, and therefore we increase the demand for labor. We actually slow down the rate of automation in the economy. That is one effect. And the second effect is if a tax on energy is a tax on capital, then it's a tax on shareholders, right? The people who own the companies. Now, if you include those two effects, you don't just look at the consumption, but you also look at the labor market and you look at capital ownership, then for a whole bunch of countries, including the United States and Canada and the Northern European countries, a carbon tax actually becomes progressive, even if you don't use the carbon revenue to compensate for the losses. That story is not true for countries like France and Italy, because they have a different labor market. What the answer would be in India, I really do not know. It's obvious that the poor people in India do not own shares in utilities or in any company, so that is pretty simple. Whether there would be a positive effect on the labor market really depends on what you assume about what is the level of underemployment. Can you increase the demand for labor without increasing the price of labor, wages, and so on and so forth? That you guys know much more about than I do. But the story that a carbon tax necessarily is regressive is no longer true.
Thank you very much. I think we have run out of time, so I'll hand over to the organizers for doing the closing formalities.
Thank you, sir, for your insightful presentation on the economic impacts of climate change, and Sri Debashish Sen for expertly chairing this session. We appreciate your valuable contributions. A special thanks to all the attendees for joining us today. We look forward to continued discussions and learning from all of you. Now, I would like to use this opportunity to express our gratitude to our session chair, Sri Debashish Sen, with this video. I also sincerely urge that Sri Debashish Sen provide Professor Toll with a memento and a bouquet on our behalf. Thank you, everyone. I would request that the audience be seated here for our next session, which is a special lecture by Professor Neerav Nagar and Professor Anirudh Singhal, and the session will be chaired by none other than Professor Zakir Hussain. Thank you, everyone.